Nobody asked for this, and if you would prefer to see just the regular video with uh, the song already done, the track already completed with the found sounds, that video also exists. But if anyone was curious about the method that I've been using so far to record these, I would love to see other people doing the same thing and finding new musical instruments around the house that they didn't know were there before. In this case, I've just recorded the Beard Care 10 on my desk that has an amazing kind of snare-like sound. So I'm going to go through the process of setting up the samples using Audacity and then importing into LMMS, and then maybe a little bit of how those samples are used and made into instruments. In this case, I have used a Zoom H1N field recorder to record those sounds, which gives me some great audio quality. It's fantastic. There's not a whole lot of noise in the background. However, the first couple of videos I did like this, I just used my cell phone, and that's really all you need, especially considering that Audacity and LMMS are both free. They're both open source. So if you have the ability to record sound somehow, you can do this for basically free, as long as you've got, a phone or a laptop. Here's the initial file that was made, and I'm just going to drop this right into Audacity. Okay, so Audacity has loaded up the file, and you can see all the waveforms here. There's a lot of silence at the beginning. There's a lot of space in between different parts. One thing I guess I should say now is getting a good recording of individual sounds. This, for instance, is where I was banging on the 10 with kind of a drum roll. Which might be good for a sound effect kind of in the middle of the song, but as a sample, that's not a very good one if I wanted to make that into a snare, because I didn't give the sample time for its rise and cutoff, if that makes any sense. This one is probably better right after that. In that case, I gave time at the beginning and after the sample to allow the object to resonate, to get the full spectrum of what it was capable of doing. What I'm looking for right now, and what I'm looking for really when I find an item around the house, is something that is percussive but also tonal. If you're a masochist like I am and you're only using one sound or one object to make samples for something, if you've only got percussive sounds, then you're only going to have a beat. Whereas if you've only got tonal sounds, it's going to be difficult to get drums out of it. In this case, I saw the 10 and gave it a couple of whacks and saw that I could get some notes out of it. Let me see if I can find some of those. So now I'm going to let Audacity do a lot of the work for me. It would be a pain to go through and save all of these into individual samples, which is how I did it in the beginning. But I since found that you can let Audacity find all the individual sounds and label them for you, and then export it into a sample pack on its own. It's fantastic. What you do is you go to Analyze and then Silence Finder or Sound Finder. I've had to go back and forth between these two for whatever's better for the individual recording that I've made. In this case, I'm going to try Sound Finder. What this does is Audacity finds all the individual peaks above a certain threshold, so there's you don't have noise getting in the way, and if it's within two silences, basically, a label will be made that will span the length of a particular sound, a particular sample. It's fairly easy. You set up the minimum audio level, which kind of varies, and I may have to do this a couple of different times depending on the track, depending on how much noise there was in the room. That thing about giving yourself space, that comes into play here also. The minimum duration of silence between sounds. So if you did something really fast, you might have a couple of sounds in the same sample, which you may or may not want. Now, Audacity has labeled all the individual sounds. And actually, this is probably all that you have to do. You could also truncate the silence, which is to say remove the silence from the track. And that might make for a more streamlined process. For me, it's hard to tell if this is one label or if this is one label. So I'm going to zoom in here and check and see if Audacity is being nice. In this case, I've missed some sounds because my threshold was set too high. I'm going to redo that because they might be useful sounds. I think I'm going to amplify the signal slightly, because for one thing, that sound that I just heard was very quiet. And to do that, I just go to Amplify from the Effects tool. Removing Allow Clipping, it doesn't allow me to do much, and that's probably because I've got one little sound here that did clip. I am going to allow the clipping on that and boost it just a little bit more because maybe I won't use that sound. There we go. So I get a little bit more volume for what I've recorded. I probably should have had the gain up on my recorder a little bit higher, but I was banging pretty loud on that thing, and I didn't want it to peak. What I could have done is turned up the gain after I was done with that, so I could have gotten some of the smaller sounds better. But that's only if you're using a recorder that has gain controls on it. So I'm going to try the Silence Finder now. It may be a better option for what I'm doing, but I'm also going to turn down the threshold a little bit. Hopefully I get all sounds and not a whole lot of noise in between sounds. Silence Finder may be the better option in this case. What it's done is it's found any silences between sounds that last a certain amount of time. You can see that after this waveform ends, there's a little bit of a delay before this next label is started. When I go into LMMS, if I've got a lot of samples that have a lot of time where the actual sound isn't being used, I'm going to have a really slow running LMMS. There are some instances where there are multiple sounds within one label, and I'm okay with that. There's a pretty good chance that I'm not going to use most of these. I'm going to find the best samples, and you can see that there are cases where I did 3 of the exact same sound. I'm going to choose the best from those. And so I'm not going to worry too much about the sample size. Now that all my individual labels have been generated by Audacity, I'm going to export them all into one folder. To do that, I'm just going to go to Export Multiple from the File menu. I've made a folder where I can keep this particular sample library. And these are the settings I'm going to use to get all of those individual labeled samples into that one folder. I'm going to rename the file name prefix into Beard Care Kit just to, when the files are generated, they will all start with that, and then they'll have numbers after them. I'm going to individually name the files after this, after listening to each individual sound for clarity, to help me later when I'm putting things together and arranging in LMMS. Now I just hit export. Audacity does this very quickly. All these samples have been sliced out, and we can exit Audacity. Because I know it'll make the process easier for me going forward, I am going to individually listen to all 50 of these and label at least the most useful ones. So I'll listen to that and decide that this is a fair possible kick drum. So I've gone through and relabeled all of the tracks, at least the most interesting ones, and the most useful ones. I've noticed that because these are all sequential, if I've got a lot of sounds that are the same or very similar, basically I'll just name the first one and then know that everything after that is going to be pretty much a variation on a theme. So if I need another version of a clang, I've got a couple more that are available to me. Now I've loaded up LMMS, and first thing I'm going to do is get rid of a few things. Any of these that I need back, I can add back in later. I won't need an automation track right away. I will need a beat bass line for what I do. Curiously, I'm going to be removing this sample track because I like the audio file processor more than LMMS's like standard sample engine. It just seems to work better for me. And we won't need an oscillator because all of the sounds will be made using audio file processor. Where we start just kind of depends on the inspiration that I get from the music or from the instrument. In this case, we've got a lot of percussion, so I know that it's going to be maybe harder for me to find something tonal. I'm going to grab one of the more tonal sounds. Let's just expand this a little bit. Tonal, high, and resonant. Now we've dropped that into the audio file processor, and if I hit a key to play it, well, that's not bad, although I did just notice that the original sound is here. So it should be about this pitch. I've just moved the root note to the first note that I'm playing, which is Z on a regular laptop. I don't have a MIDI keyboard with me, so we'll be doing a lot of playing on the laptop itself or maybe painting. I'm going to move the start point of this to the very beginning of the sound. So as soon as I hit the key, I can get that sound. I'm going to dial that in a little bit more too. Pro tip, if you want to zoom in on the sound quickly, barely touch that amplify and even put it back to 100 when you're done, and it'll zoom in to the waveform that you have selected between the start and end points. So now I can get this right up on the beginning. And this is vaguely tonal, but I may have to do a little bit of work on it. If nothing else, it sounds a little bit like a rim shot. I've pulled in a second sound here that seems to have a little bit more tonality. Interestingly, it has some harmonics, almost like a sub bass underneath it. Which, if I wanted to, I could dial in and use an equalizer to maybe find that a little more. Maybe bring that forward a little bit in the mix of it. Using this equalizer effect, I can find the sound that is most interesting to me and maybe pull it in. Now, there's a downside to this. The downside is that because this is a sample, it's not a synthesizer. If I make a change to make like a band, where right here, this is where I want that sound, you'll notice that as I play higher on the scales, the EQ is following that, but not the changes I've made with this particular peak. So it's not something I do very often. The only EQs that I typically will do is to give each sound a little bit of its own real estate. If I know I want to make a bass drum, I'll roll off the highs. I don't need a whole lot of high frequencies in a bass drum, and it'll just make everything else muddy. If there's frequencies that are playing on a bass that will interfere with frequencies that would be playing on a lead or something like that. So in this case, with this slightly tonal bang, I may roll off the highs and the lows. If you go too high, you won't get much sound at all. This is something you develop an ear for, and it's something that's helpful to have headphones for. Actually, if you're trying to just dial in real estate for mastering, for EQing. Basically, all that you're doing is moving in the bottom and the top. Listening for any changes. If you can move the high down until just before the point where any changes have been made, then you're set, and you don't have any radical frequencies that'll affect anything else. Which is something that you should know for all of your recordings, by the way. This is another situation. I'm auditioning a second or a third sound actually, but just like the second one, there are overtones on this sound because of the way that 10 was resonating, where there are two sounds being played at the same time. Hard to hear, but there is a da 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 being played at the same time. Now, the track that I did with the sound effects from my hands actually had the same problem. In that each of the little hand farts had two very pronounced sounds. So when I played a chord, it actually added an extra, like a seventh, which is fine, and it actually influenced the way that song came to be, because I played a chord and heard a second chord because of the harmonics. Now, in this case, we're going to see what that does, if that leads to some kind of inspiration. Yeah, popcorn. So I've done some EQing on the three potential kind of lead sounds I have so far. I've done a quick play of, I was doing popcorn, so I thought I might as well go with it, for each of the different sounds. And I'm sort of auditioning them now to see which ones I like, or if I like some of them together, which is a possibility. There's no one telling me I can't do that. So here's the first one. It is probably the most percussive of the three. Not sure how I like that for a lead. I think it might be more interesting kind of in the background, kind of supporting the lead. Here's the second one. That one has more potential. And then there's the third one. There are some overtones there that I would, if I was being serious, I would like to try to find some way to remove. But I really think this is the best contender for what I'm working on right now. I'm definitely not going to do a cover of Popcorn. That was a joke, but it does give me an opportunity to test which of these is the best. Now, here's what it sounds like with all three of them together. This really snappy first sound here gives all of this the sound almost like a quad drum that you might see in a marching band. If I remove that, I'm feeling a little bit of perhaps like a steel drum kind of sound. And the reason I'm saying this and even thinking about it is that it's going to influence how I make a melody from here. Like I say, we've got some overtones, and that will kind of color any chords that I make. I think a pad will be the next step. I'm going to take probably this bottom one here and see if I can extend the sound by having it start the same way, but repeating on some of the later waveform. So let's work on building a pad from this sound that we have here. It would be easiest if I had a very resonant thing like the hard drive platter or the vertical file folder. They resonated for a long time, so I had a lot to work with. In this case, the sound is very quick. But generally, what I want to do when I create a pad, I've got the sound effect basically as I want it. I'm going to get rid of some of the attack on the envelope, just so I get less percussion in the beginning. So instead of tick, 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 we get vaguely like a very rough violin string, which I may use for the lead sound too. I'll keep that in mind. Now, I want to have this. I want to have this be able to hold, because the sound is so quick. It's not a very good pad. But using the repeat options here or the loop options in audio file processor, I can have the sample play up until a certain point and then begin to loop in place, which I can hold forever. This is the loop playback point, or the midpoint. If I turn on this loop and hold down this button, you'll see that it'll play all the way through and then begin again at this blue line. There are two options here. There is the loop, the regular enable loop here, where it does just that. It starts from this midpoint and continues again if the note is held. There's also the ping pong loop, which means it'll play until the very end and then reverse back to the blue point and then play from there back and forth. It's a different sound, and it may actually be a better option if I can dial in a good enough section of this waveform. So to do that, I am going to move this endpoint and zoom in. Here's the important part about looping. And I'm going to zoom in real close if I can. So here's my waveform, and say I wanted it to loop all the way from beginning to end, over and over. That is a usable pad, but it's kind of grating. What's happening is the start point and end point are at different parts of this repeating waveform you can see. To sum it up, basically what I need to do is get the start point and the end point of the loop at the exact same spot between the troughs here. And if you do that, you can get rid of that kind of tapping noise. Or at least minimize it. It's a difference between a very crunchy sound and a smoother sound. Now, another thing about pads is that I would love to have way more waves than this so that I don't have this kind of bit crunched, kind of almost distorted sound. I want to give this as much room as possible, and there's enough of this kind of repeating waveform here that I think I can get away with that, even though I may have to use the ping pong for it to work. I have found that you can do it by eye by moving these different dividers, but then dial it in with these knobs here. I'm going to take this back to the beginning of the actual sound, because I think that gives me some perspective on what this end should sound like. I think right now that it's too sawtoothy, it's too crunchy, and I would prefer to have a smoother sound on the end. Getting kind of a jackhammer sound. I think I've got it dialed in to a better point, at least, knowing that that's the original sound and this is the padded sound. I don't hate it. So I've got the loop points set to just about where I want them to stay. The next part is I'm going to play with this envelope a little bit. I would like to get a little bit of sustain. There we go. Oh, that was easy enough. Just so that when I release the key, it doesn't just fall off right away, like that. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give this a little bit of reverb, and the plate 2x2 is fine. For a pad, I am just going to completely drench it in reverb. You get a lot of the original sound there, but it also has this otherworldly quality where this could just be playing behind the rest of everything, which is probably going to be what it does. It is doing something I don't want, though, which is not being held for very long. So you'll notice if I hold this chord, there's going to be a drop in the volume after a moment. Right there. I haven't let go of the keys, but the volume has suddenly dropped. I'm going to extend the hold and remove the decay. And then it'll only stop playing when I let go of the keys. All right, some other things we can do on the reverb side of things. If I wanted to give this more bandwidth, which is to say, if I wanted the reverb to have more real estate on the EQ, more space in the spectrum, I could increase this. Usually I won't do that because, like I say, I want everything to have its own kind of living space on that spectrum. I'm going to remove damping, I think. I'm happy with that. Tail is really the amount of sustained reverb at the end of once everything is played. I think that's maybe overdoing it a little bit. I would like to have a pad that I can fairly easily switch from one chord to another. And I think that'll work. So now we've got a very usable pad. It does have some crunchy bassiness to it, which I may be able to fix with the equalizer a little bit. It's almost like a bell in a way. I don't know if that's coming through on the microphone. It's like if a bell suddenly morphed into a violin halfway through resonating, and kind of like an organ as well. All right, so I think that pad is usable. There's some other things we can do, like maybe stack it up an octave. If you like organs, that's the way to go. Let me do one. I wish I could turn down the wet-dry mix of this a little bit, but it's fine. If I hate it too much, I'll just remove the stacking. And then just paint everything 2 times, because that's the way that works. Out of curiosity, what happens if I do a high pass and I only let the higher frequencies in? I don't know, but I think I may automate this frequency a little bit here, this cutoff frequency on the high pass. Because that is a beautiful sound. And in fact, I can do that here. The cutoff I can do an LFO on. Right above the envelope is the target of the envelope and LFO generators. If I go to cutoff, this will be the LFO affecting just the cutoff frequency of the filter. This is going through the entire range of this frequency knob right now, and I liked it really close to the bottom. So I'm going to remove most of the amount of that. Okay, I don't hate that. I think that's perfectly usable. I need to watch my levels a little bit. I can see on my master here that I'm getting dangerously close to peaking. And just noodling around on the keyboard and kind of seeing what sticks. It's a lot to do with inspiration when you hear these kinds of instruments. So now I'm going to be switching back and forth between a couple of instruments and kind of figuring out what sounds good together. I do think that I am going to take a little bit of the attack off of this lead sound. I think I liked the way that sounded. So I've done a little bit of noodling, and I've come up with something that's at least interesting. The sound is so percussive that I can't really do anything that... I can't do anything with a lot of sustain, so it's very tick, tick, tick. However, I did come up with something interesting for a bass. The bass I didn't do a whole lot with. I just took the sound that I had used for the pad and lowered it maybe about 2 octaves. So where this is kind of where the pad had been, the bass is this. There's only a few things I've done to that. If you take a look at the effects, I've changed the equalizer on it a little bit. We're going all the way to the bottom to get the real chunky bass frequencies. The reverb is still there, but I've taken a lot of that out. It's a pretty subtle reverb on that. I didn't want the bass to ring out over everything. But what really sells the bass in this particular one, and this is not an effect that I have used a whole lot, but this calf bass enhancer with these settings here, I've added basically some sub bass and kind of added a couple of the harmonics back in below that. I don't know how well that's coming in through the mic, but it's a real chunky bass. What I like about the track that I've got as it stands is more the bass than anything else. Everything else seems to be percussion on top of it. Here's what we're looking at right now. Something I've got going against me is, again, the harmonics, the overtones on our main kind of lead sample. It is straight up 2 notes being played. really has kind of taken away my options in terms of like chords. I tried to do some chord stuff at the beginning, and it just would not work because it there's so much dissonance from those overtones. Like, believe me when I say that it affects the music. But anyway, the bass is more interesting. It is more like this. On the lower bass, I've got some pitch automation going on. And if you've never done that before, it's real simple. You just use the pitch bend mode, click on the note itself, and just like the other automation tools, you can kind of draw where the note should be. So the pitch kind of fades up here and then fades down here. I've increased the attack a little bit because I wanted this to really swell in. Because the notes overlap, it doesn't have to swell here. The attack is already triggered at this point, so this is still in the hold of that envelope. So I think because of that, because this is so bass heavy, you're getting a lot of that bass as the star, and then the only other thing that comes through is the really ticky sound of these, which I will probably lower a little bit in the mix because they are coming through really loud. They feel more like tuned percussion than lead. So I want to figure out some way I can use maybe the same way that I've got these sounds set up to maybe get a higher lead out of it and just work with the EQs a little bit. Something that will kind of support the higher end of this a little bit better than what we've got so far. Okay, I've come up with something that I don't hate as a lead. I did just take this kind of pad that has become what I'm calling space bass, increased it by a couple of octaves, and also cut off a little bit more of the attack portion of this sample. So now we've got a sound. Beyond that, I did adjust the high pass filter, I think, a little bit. I do have a small amount of LFO on that resolution, which is, I think, similar to what we have for the pad. For the effects, I did take down the reverb quite a bit. It's not nearly as pronounced as it is in the pad. Changed the equalizer a little bit to include all the high frequencies because I want this to stand out on that end of the spectrum. And then also I added a delay. It's not right in your face. It is a little more wet than dry. So and I've got a lot of feedback on it, so it'll last for a while. And then I'm just playing around with a little something just to carry the lead here a little bit. So this is what I've got. I'm not in love with that right now, but it does kind of get the point across. What I'm going to do next is add some actual drums, because right now, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but the beat bass line is just the default kicker right now, just to give me basically a metronome. I'm going to replace that with some other drum sounds, which I guess we should do now. We'll get into the drum portion of things. I'm lucky with this kind of sample set because they're so percussive. So I'm going to start off with an entirely new audio file processor, and I've named this one Kick, so let's hope that I did this right. By the way, I don't know if you can tell, but it's been a few days since I started. That's why I'm really glad that I labeled these. Yeah, that's pretty good for a kick. Okay, let's see if I can find a good snare sound. I'm just going to use the same one, copy it. And here's one that we labeled snare. It's a pretty good snare. I think I'm going to take a page from the 80s with some gated reverb on this. And this is something I'll do with a lot of my snare drums because I am kind of a fan of the 80s. We'll put some reverb with a very slight tail that'll basically get kind of the same point across. There we go. To me, that sort of emulates the sound of snare springs kind of vibrating against the membrane. And I don't know how well that's coming across in the mix. In fact, let me turn it up and see if you can hear that any better. So, versus. And then let's just add some incidental percussion. Oh, we have a closed hat. Perfect. Well, I said closed hat at the time. I don't know if I believe myself now. I don't know if that's going to clash too much with what we've already got going on. So I think I am going to keep this pretty light. You don't want to do a whole lot of addition when it comes to EQing. Really, it's more of a subtractive process. I think I'm at a point where I want to kind of layer these sounds in together, and I want to arrange everything, basically is what I'm saying, and allow that to maybe inspire some other parts, especially with this lead. Again, I'm not terribly in love with that yet, so let me see if just by laying these out a little bit over time, I can get more of a feel for where this musically wants to go. Okay, I'm at a point where I think I am probably done. I like what I've created, and it's also 2 o'clock in the morning, so it's probably stopping time. But I do like what I've made, and I want to show you a couple of things that I added during the process of arrangement. That always gives me a little bit of inspiration, kind of as things come together. I realize what's missing from a section, or if something's too much. So speaking of that, I found that at the beginning, when everything was kind of coming together, the drum sounds, I didn't want to overdo it, but it got really predictable. There was a lot of the same sound over and over again. So what I ended up doing is adding in some samples not affected in any way, just set to the beat. So in this case, this extra beat that comes in this portion of the song is this. And just by virtue of being on a grid, they are rhythmic. This smaller one here is the same thing, except with a few beats missing, and that's all that is. I actually have this play throughout the rest of the song because it's subtle. I just have all these different instruments, all these different sounds kind of panned so that they're not all in one spot. They're also pretty low on the in terms of volume. Other than that, while I was doing that, I found this interesting sound. It's a really quiet sound, but it is going ba-da-da-da, and it's the tines of a comb as I was plucking it with my thumbnail. That's a nice little pluck that I kind of forgot was there, and I was just throwing these different samples on here, and I realized that would make a great little pluck, a nice little high-pitched sound, and that became this comb tine sound. So it is an additional lead, but it is very much in the background of the track. So at this part, well, I guess I could show you what I've got going on here. Let's go ahead and play that. Starting off with just something to show you what the sample was. Adding in that percussion to make it a little bit more dynamic. More percussion. We've got a new pad here with a comb filter on it that's being animated by an LFO. And this is what those tines sound like. Just doing an arpeggio that I just kind of painted in and copied. It's at a polyrhythm right now with the rest of the song because it is something like I think a six note arpeggio. So it will repeat several times before it gets back in beat with the rest of the instruments. So a couple of things are going on between the comb tines and this pad that I've added. This is the same pad I think we had before. The only thing I've done is added a comb filter, which is a type of filter that rather than doing just the highs or just the lows or just a notch in the middle, it's imagine a comb. There's a lot of very small removals of frequencies. which is interesting on its own. But if you animate where that separation comes in with an LFO, like I've done, just one little LFO controller with these settings. It's a very slow LFO. And all it is doing is making this just go back and forth without going too low, because if it goes too low, it gets a little crazy. So I've got that same comb filter on both the tines. If I just limit this, you should be able to kind of hear it as it goes through. You can kind of hear those overtones just kind of shifting. It's a kind of sound. And that is happening to both this pad and those tines. I don't think I did a whole lot else to this pad except made it really heavy on the high end on the equalizer, which is something I said not to do, but don't listen to me. Do your own thing. I did add in a little bit more bass towards the end just to kind of fill it out. I did use this lead with the little arpeggio and the swift arpeggio to this high note holding, but I didn't use it. It's more in the background. It's more of an atmosphere thing. It's very low volume. It's the exact same instrument as this, so it's really just more in the background. I don't think I did a whole lot more than that, other than adjusting a few things on the end of these particular segments. That's going really granular. That's mostly it. So we've got everything here. 100% was made from the samples. There's no oscillators or anything like that. There are a few things where I had to get really selective with the waveforms, but I wanted to make sure that the character of those waveforms was still that of the original samples. This is fun. This is such a fun process, and I would love to see so many more people do it. If this is, too granular, too in the weeds about things, don't worry so much about that. Go out and record some samples. Set them to a beat. I mean, just like I did with this here. Nothing has been done to these samples at all. And that's rhythmic and musical, and something can be made from it. And if you just get something that makes a tone recorded, then you've already got your instrument for your lead sections. So please, somebody go out and make more of these. LMMS is free. Audacity is free. And most people have a phone. If you've got a laptop and you're watching this, then you probably have a phone. Record something on your phone. Throw it into Audacity. Save that out as a WAV file. Import it into LMMS using the audio file processor. And have fun. Please send me links to your videos or your audio of this process of found sound. I would absolutely love to see it. That's it. That's all. I'm going to post this video as its own kind of standalone tutorial, and then the regular video will also be posted as normal without all of my rambling. So appreciate everybody. Thank you to the LMMS community on Reddit. You guys are awesome. Have fun.